This is Don at Airbrush Technique Magazine, airbrushmag.com. Over the last 5 or 6 years of running our airbrush support forum at airbrushmag.com, one of the most common questions we hear is, how do I take my airbrush apart to clean it? How do I put it back together after I've cleaned it? Here we're going to take an Iwata Micron C apart, a CMC, and then put it back together. First thing you want to do is remove the back handle. Put this all in a bowl or a cup so that you don't lose the parts. Don't do it over the sink so they fall down the drain. Remove the chucking nut, it just unscrews. Carefully remove the needle. Remove the chucking nut guide. It just unscrews also. Remove the spring and the guide itself. Remove the trigger. To get the trigger out, you have to turn the trigger and pull it straight up. It has those little pins in it. Then there's another little piece that goes on the trigger here. Don't lose that. Next, we'll remove the protective cap for the needle. The air cap, which will expose the tip. To get the tip off, you'd use a little wrench that Iwata provides. When you put the tip back on, make sure you don't over tighten it and snap the threads off. Remember, righty tighty, lefty loosey when you're doing this. Remove this forward part, the air cap nozzle. Clean it out, and when you go to reassemble it, it's just the opposite. Put the head cap back on. It just screws in. Make sure you don't cross thread it. Put your air cap back on. Again, making sure you don't cross thread it. Put the needle cap back on. Now for the trigger. This little tiny piece goes behind the trigger. And as you can see, it's arched here. The arched part of this little part goes in back of the trigger. We'll put that in first and lean it against the back of the airbrush. To put it in, it's straight down and then turn it once you're in there. Lean it against the back of the airbrush. To put the trigger in, it has these little posts. You have to put it in and then turn it once you're in there. And it aligns right over the air valve. Once it's in, you push down on the trigger and it springs back up. Put the chuck guide in. It's slotted. It'll only go in one way. Once it's in, make sure that that little piece is against the back of the trigger here. Right here. Put your spring on. Screw the guide housing back in. Again, don't cross thread it. Use some super lube on your needle. You can get it at any Iwata retailer. Anyone who sells Iwata airbrushes ought to be able to get you super lube. Carefully put your needle back in. Chucking nut and back handle. If you've cleaned it properly and assembled it the way I just showed you, it should work just fine. Test it, push down on the trigger, it should bounce back up. Pull back on the trigger and you should be able to see the needle moving back and forth. This is Don, Airbrush Technique Magazine, the best airbrush magazine published. If you have any further questions about airbrushing, airbrush equipment, please feel free to register on airbrushtechnique.com, our airbrush support forum. Thank you.